next topic focuses on tobacco harm reduction. And Dr. Colin Mendelsohn is joining us from Australia. He is one of Australia's leading experts on smoking and vaping. He is the founding chairman of the Australian Tobacco Harm Reduction Association charity and is a member of the committee that develops national smoking cessation guidelines. He works with smokers to help them quit and is actively involved in research, teaching, and writing about smoking and vaping. He is the author of The Healthy Truth About Vaping, Everything You Need to Know About Vaping and How to Switch from Smoking. Dr. Colin Mendelsohn joins us virtually from Sydney, Australia, and it's already morning tomorrow in Australia, and we thank him very much for waking up early. And I'll kick it off to you, Dr. Mendelsohn, for your presentation, and we'll come back to you with questions from the room and our virtual attendees.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for asking me to talk on this very controversial but yet very important subject. The reason we need to talk about tobacco harm reduction is that quitting smoking is very difficult. 15% of Canadians still smoke. Most want to quit and most try repeatedly to quit but fail. And many who do quit relapse. And so long-term success rates are very low. This graph shows that even with cold turkey, about 3 to 5% of smokers who have quit or who try to quit are still abstinent at 6 to 12 months. But even with in randomized controlled trials with the best therapies and support, long-term quit rates, so at 12 months, on average about 8%. And by 4 years, that's dropped to 6%. So that leaves huge numbers of quitters still trying and still suffering from the health effects of smoking, which we're all too aware of. So that's why we need tobacco harm reduction. It's to help those smokers who can't quit or won't quit tobacco or nicotine. And it's all about reducing the harm in people who would otherwise be still smoking. And the principle is to replace high-risk combustible products like cigarettes and cigars with low-risk non-combustible alternatives. Because we know that almost all of the harm from smoking is from burning tobacco leaf and creating the 7,000 toxic chemicals and poisons that generates. Because in vaping, there's no combustion or smoke, and most of those chemicals are absent or are present in very low doses. Now, what we're doing here is no different to what we do in so many other areas of public health. In the drug harm reduction area, that includes methadone, for example, or buprenorphine for street heroin users who can't otherwise quit. So there's nothing new about this principle, but it's more recently used for smoking, for tobacco, which of course is the leading cause of preventable death globally. One of the barriers to vaping is the misperceptions about nicotine. The fact is that nicotine is addictive, but it's actually relatively benign. It's not harmless, but it's relatively benign. And for example, Public Health England has said nicotine use per se represents minimal risk of serious harm to physical health. And many organisations support that. Because nicotine doesn't cause cancer, it doesn't cause lung disease, and it only plays a relatively minor role in heart disease. So although nicotine is being continued, the harm from that is relatively minor. But in addition to that, there are actually a lot of positive benefits from nicotine. And we're not encouraging people to take it up, but smokers, for example, use nicotine for some of the positive benefits which we're very aware of. And these include the pleasure that it gives just in releasing dopamine. It helps to improve concentration, alertness, and memory. It does have a short-term relaxing effect and improves mood. It helps with weight control. And there are a number of diseases that we know are improved by nicotine. And these include schizophrenia, where there is a deficit and where nicotine actually corrects some of the dysfunction. in the brain. It's neuroprotective, it's good for Parkinson's disease, it helps people with ADHD, it certainly helps ulcerative colitis, increases the pain threshold, and it does have anti-inflammatory effects, which may well be of benefit to some smokers. So nicotine does have some problems, some small problems, but perhaps the benefits outweigh the risks, which is perhaps a little bit controversial, but I think the evidence is quite strong now. So tobacco harm reduction is based on this continuum of risk. So products which contain nicotine range from the right-hand end of this table, which are the combustible products, which put the user at high risk, to the left-hand end of the table, where you have products like e-cigarettes, nicotine replacement products, and the other safer alternatives I'm going to talk about. So what we're trying to do is move people from that end of the table on the right to the non-combustible end down the left, where the risks are much greater. And then, if possible, we'd like to move them all together to a nicotine-free situation, but of course, most of the benefit comes from that first step. And that continuum of risk is very important in this discussion, because we know that nicotine with smoke is doing the harm, and we can get rid of the smoke and reduce that harm with alternative products. So let's talk first of all about vaping and vaping nicotine, and then I'll come to some of the other smoke-free and reduced harm alternatives. So nicotine vaping involves using a battery-operated device, which has a battery and which has a heating coil, which heats the liquid in the chamber and vaporizes it when the smoker breathes in or presses a button. The heating coil is activated, the liquid becomes a vapor and is inhaled and delivered to the patient, and then they breathe out a smoke-like vapor. And so what they're doing is, nicotine vaping it's basically a nicotine delivery system. It's all about giving people the nicotine. But it's unique in that it also replicates the smoking rituals, the sensations, and the social aspects of smoking. And that's why it's so successful. And most importantly, there's no smoke, there's no combustion, and no tobacco in these products. So that's why it's a much safer replacement. So these products are battery operated. They come in many different types, and you can see on the right some of the different types of devices that are available. For new users, the pod vapes are generally preferred. They're very easy to use, but there's a whole range of different options depending on people's preferences. Disposables are good as a transition option. There are much more complex options if people prefer them or if they want to progress. But they all heat the nicotine liquid into a vapor which the user inhales, and they mimic that hand-to-mouth smoking experience. These products are also quite effective. So reviews of randomized controlled trials and meta-analyses have shown in general that they increase success rates by at least 50 to 70% compared to nicotine replacement therapy. And there's moderate quality evidence for that. We need more trials, but the evidence is fairly consistent in the quality trials. Now that shows causation, of course. The randomized control trial shows that these products actually work. But there are other types of studies that support that moderate level of evidence, and these include all these studies in the real world. So in the real world, we know that the observational studies where we follow a cohort of smokers who try vaping, we know that it works in those sorts of studies. In populations, we know that people who use vaping are more likely to quit than people who don't or who use other methods. And we know that in countries where vaping is widely available, quit rates are increasing, smoking rates are falling much faster than in countries like Australia, where vaping is not readily available. And there's, of course, hundreds of thousands of anecdotal stories to support that. But the key message, I think, is yes, it works, but what's the population impact of vaping? And I think the bottom line here is that impact is calculated according to how effective it is, but also how popular it is and what its reach is, how much people will actually use it. Well, vaping is probably the most effective quitting aid, and it's the most popular quitting aid in Western countries. There are 82 million vapers, or were last year, an estimated 82 million vapers. So if you multiply the effectiveness by the reach, the reach of the product, you would expect that there would be a huge potential public health benefit. One of the problems with a lot of the treatments we have is that people just don't use them, and they don't use them properly. But vaping is popular, and it certainly will reach a lot of smokers. Vaping is not risk-free. There are small amounts of chemicals in vapor, but the overwhelming scientific evidence is that it's far less harmful than smoking. These are the reports from a variety of reputable health organisations which state that vaping is certainly safer than smoking, and the College of Physicians, Public Health England say it's at least 95% safer. The exact number doesn't matter. Generally, it's far safer than smoking. And you can see across the board, Health Canada says vaping is less harmful. Exactly how much less harmful, we don't know, but 95% is a good indication to give people a ballpark of where the risk lies. And the reason the risk is so low is because vapers have dramatically reduced exposure to the toxins in smoke. So in smoke, there's over 7,000 chemicals. In studies looking at individual vaping products, it's generally less than 100. And in that vapor, the chemicals that are present in smoking are generally less than 5% and mostly less than 1% of what they are in smoke. So clearly there's going to be less exposure, and when you measure those chemicals in the body, they're at much lower levels. So we know that less of these poisons are getting into the body of the vapor. But also importantly, the studies that have been done so far show that there are significant improvements in health. So the heart attack risk improves, asthma improves, there are significant improvements in COPD, blood pressure drops if you've got blood pressure and you switch to vaping. There's a couple of studies that show that. People get less lung infections and they certainly breathe better and they feel better. I mean, they always say to me, my patients say, look, I can breathe better, I have more energy, my cough's gone. So people notice the difference. The risk of cancer from vaping has been calculated at less than 0.4% of that due to smoking. And there's no evidence of harm from secondhand vapor so far. However, there are a lot of myths about vaping, and this is why the area is controversial. I think some of these myths are deliberately driven, but some of them are genuine misunderstandings. The biggest concern, of course, is vaping a gateway to smoking? And I guess the bottom line from this is that some kids who would maybe not have smoked try vaping and may go on to smoking, but the evidence suggests that it's far more likely to be a gateway out of smoking. So we know that most kids who vape just do it experimentally. They try it for a while, then they stop. Most of the kids who start vaping are already smokers, and most of the kids who vape regularly are actually already smokers. So regular vaping is rare if you're just trying it for the first time. And that's what we see in the population data. So in the United States, in the National Youth Tobacco Survey, in high schoolers, you can see that the red line on this study shows that, yes, vaping rates increased significantly, although they've dropped 60% amongst high schoolers, that's 15 to 18-year-olds, in the last 2 years. And smoking rates are continuing to fall, but not only fall, they've actually accelerated. So since 2013, when vaping became more widespread in the US, the smoking rate has declined by an extra 40% compared to what it was before 2013. So the smoking rate has accelerated in its decline, and we think it's certainly a significant part of that is due to vaping. It's certainly not increasing smoking to any extent. Then there's a concern that vaping nicotine harms the adolescent brain. Well, there's no evidence of harm in humans. I think that's really important. We know that there's evidence in animal studies which often don't relate to outcomes in humans. And we know that of the hundreds of millions of people who smoked, there's no evidence later in life that they are more harmed in terms of brain function than people who didn't smoke. We would expect to see something out of all the people who have smoked, but there's no evidence of any difference in IQ or cognitive abilities. But one thing we are sure of, and this is very important, and it's important to know that if you're a mouse or a rat and you're an adolescent, it's very important not to vape. And that's because we do have research to show that that is harmful to the brain in those users. But the evidence doesn't seem to be there for humans. Then there was the outbreak of EVALI. Well, we're pretty clear now. That was an outbreak of serious lung injury, mainly in the United States, due to contaminated THC vaping oils. And those were black market products that were adulterated with vitamin EA, which is cutting agent. There have been no cases linked to nicotine liquids, to commercial products. So this is, I think, a myth in terms of nicotine vaping. We need to keep that separate from THC vaping. Popcorn lung is another very widespread myth. This is a serious lung disease from exposure to high doses of diacetyl in factory workers in popcorn factories. But it's rarely used now, diacetyl. The levels in vapor are far less than they are in smoking, and there has never been a case of popcorn lung from vaping or even from smoking where the levels of diacetyl are extremely high. So I think we can discard this myth quite safely. The other concern is that this is all the big tobacco conspiracy. So big tobacco is just trying to hook more kids on nicotine, keep people smoking, keep their profits up. Well, it's important to know that big tobacco did not invent vaping. It was developed by a pharmacist who smoked in 2003. Big tobacco got involved from about 2012 when they could see that this was a serious disruptive threat. And they only control, well, less than 20% of the global vaping market. So they're a relatively small player. And this is a huge disruptive threat to them. They can see their customers are switching and they're at risk of a Kodak moment unless they join the party and become involved. And they are actually transitioning to safer products. And you can see from this graph that PMI, for example, 30% of their revenue now is from reduced risk products. All the companies are moving in that direction. The companies that are moving in that direction have much stronger share prices because the market recognizes that this is the way that vaping and smoking are going. But I think the bottom line, as far as I'm concerned, is that it doesn't matter who makes these products as long as they save lives. So if a product is going to help someone, prevent someone from dying from smoking, if the big tobacco companies make it, does that really matter if it's going to stop that person from serious illnesses and possibly death? We all prefer the tobacco companies weren't involved, but they're not going to go away. And I think they're doing the right thing, not out of the goodness of their hearts. This is a commercial decision, but basically our interests are aligned at the moment. There are other reduced risk products. Swedish snus has a long history of success in Scandinavian countries. This is a finely ground tobacco product, which comes in mostly in little pouches, which go up under the upper lip. Nicotine's absorbed at quite high levels, and it's been very successful in Sweden and Norway. There are heated tobacco products, which the tobacco companies do make, in which a small tobacco stick, especially developed tobacco stick, is placed in an electronic device which is heated but not burned. There's no combustion. And this helps to replicate the hand-to-mouth. People use this like a cigarette, the hand-to-mouth effect, and it replicates the tobacco flavour and experience a bit more than vaping. The risks are slightly higher, but it's another option and far less harmful than smoking. And then there's the new modern oral or nicotine pouches. So this is basically like snus, but you have nicotine in a cellulose matrix in a little pouch, no tobacco, goes up under the upper lip, releases nicotine, less harmful even than snus, and another very effective alternative in nicotine replacement. In terms of regulation, we've made the mistake of giving all our emphasis to young people. So the regulations in most countries have been based about protecting kids at all costs, but we've forgotten about the billion smokers in the world, the adult smokers who can't quit. And I think we need to get that balance right, and I think we can. And what we need to do is maintain strict regulation in terms of youth access, and there's no reason we can't do that like we do with every other adult product, but allow adults to access quality, safe products that they can use as an alternative to smoking. So that's the ideal model, and I think we should be able to achieve that. So this involves strict age verification for purchase, proportionate regulation where the more dangerous product is more regulated and restricted than the less dangerous product. And in many countries, it's the opposite of that, certainly in Australia. We have to recognise that flavours are very important and an integral part of vaping, and it makes them more effective as a quitting aid for adults. And the role in young people is controversial and I think doubtful. We need to make it need for there to be a cost incentive to encourage smokers to make the switch. We need good quality standards, and we need to monitor these products over time. And I think we need to encourage as many adults to make the switch while restricting access to young people. Now it's time for an advertisement. As was mentioned earlier, my book is an educational resource for smokers, vapers, policymakers. It's evidence-based, 400 references. It's all about the evidence for vaping, how to make the switch, all about the practical issues for new vapers. It talks about all the controversies, and it's available from all the usual online booksellers like Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and you can find more information about it on my website. So, in conclusion, I think vaping is a legitimate and other lower risk alternatives, a legitimate option for smokers who just can't quit. We know that these products are substantially safer than combustible products. Vaping is the most effective quitting aid and probably the most popular, and it's diverting youth away from smoking. Overall, the net benefit is positive in terms of youth. There are heated tobacco products, snus, and nicotine pouches, which are also effective. We need to educate people. There's an enormous amount of misinformation in the public about nicotine and about these safer products. And I think the bottom line is that there's more potential to reduce the smoking-related death and harms from this quitting aid than any other aid or any other intervention that we've got.
Thank you for your presentation. We really appreciate it. I'm wondering if anyone has any questions in the room or online, they can go up to the microphones. Maybe a quick question here, because I know you're going to stick with us after our next break and participate in a panel, but the goal still, the end state goal, it would be still cessation or not smoking or vaping at all, right? But your argument here is this is the pathway, and in your perspective, right?
Exactly. This is an alternative for smokers who just can't quit, who would otherwise be smoking. So the first goal is to get them off the combustible elements of cigarettes and other combustible products. If they can then move on from that to neither, and many do. That's obviously preferred. But our primary goal is to get them off the combustible poisons. So yes, if they can quit vaping later, that's great. If they can't, well, I think that's it's still an acceptable option to keep them on that much lower risk alternative.
Have you seen some examples of, I guess, those regulatory kind of rules to make sure that the vaping isn't an opportunity for youth to come in and use that? Like you talked about, there needs to be strict guidelines with penalties and et cetera. Yeah. Any jurisdictions that you would point to that are achieving that or best in class, or is it still a work in progress?
Yeah. Look, it's still work in progress, but the closest we've got is New Zealand and the UK. So basically, you need to make these products available from adult-only outlets where there's strict age verification. You can get third-party age verification for online sales. You need strict penalties and enforcement, loss of license, severe fines, but loss of license. And obviously, you need to avoid marketing to young people. You need to frame vaping as an adult cessation product. And of course, it may still have a role for young smokers, although that's controversial. But I think if you're approaching it in that way, as they are have been in the UK for some years, it does work.
All right. I think what we'll do, Dr. Mendelsohn, is we'll take a quick break here in the room, and then we'll assemble our other panelists to kind of continue this conversation about nicotine, if that works for you. If you can take a quick pause, and we'll be back.